Welcome, everybody, to the fourth session of our Virtual Production 201 series about color management for in-camera VFX on an LED volume. I am joined today by three expert panelists in the field. First, we have Rod Bogart, is a principal color scientist in the Virtual Production Tools team at Epic Games, concentrating on color pipelines. He's a member of the Visual Effects branch of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, is a vice chair of ACES, and a member of SMPTE and VES, and his initials are RGB, so it was meant to be. Kris Murray is the CTO of Machina, where he is focused on the intersection of technology and workflow for virtual production. He draws from his experience in film and TV, themed entertainment, broadcast, live events, theater, and concert touring. He is a SMPTE and ACM member. And we have Ritchie, who is the Director of R&D at Fuse Technical Group. He is also the co-chair for SMPTE's RIS Interop Working Group and the LED lead for the Entertainment Technology Center's Virtual Production Working Group. His focus is on simplifying the complexities of cutting-edge display technologies for use in real-time production environments. Rod, Kris, and Ritchie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks indeed.
All right, so let's start off by setting the stage, no pun intended. When we talk about LED volumes or LED stages, there's actually a quite wide variety of what those can look like. I think for many people, we hear LED volume and we imagine those giant, circular stages that go up for several stories. But there's actually a lot more to it than that. Kris, could you start by giving us kind of a breakdown of the range of sizes and setups for these?
Yeah, I think there's sort of an accepted norm that we're starting to see the end of, I think, which is building large, elaborate LED volumes like you've described. I think there's a number of other solutions like that we've done in the past, which are more bespoke in tuned specifically to a production need. And that might be car process rigs, things outside of windows, might be projectors, might be LED, even something like a TV outside of a porthole. Like there's a number of different solutions that we can deploy leveraging display technology.
Yeah, I guess just adding that the big wraparound displays are really an intersection between in-camera displays as well as image-based lighting. So the advantage of the big displays is that they throw light from outside the camera frustum into the scene as well, and light the talent in a way that matches with possibly moving elements, but also some color match with the environment that's appearing in camera. That's not always necessary. Again, if you're using more of a practical set, you've got a set built with a window and you put some display outside of it, you might have just standard lighting in that space. And so there's, again, a whole gamut of options that we can use here.
And then what about with the setups, the difference between, when we would use, a bunch of render nodes to render something in real time through a game engine, or when we would just film something and play it back on a screen behind the talent?
Yeah, it's similar to the options provided by the different volume types. It may be easier to just go shoot some plate if you're in an established environment and you're reproducing a piece of reality, whereas if you're making more of a fantastical scene or something that's just not feasible to go shoot, then a rendered or built, I guess, asset might be more appropriate. So again, there's creative choices very early on in this process as to how you may approach the content.
The camera may move intentionally during the shot, and the content behind the wall, the virtual content behind the wall, can react to that if it's a 3D environment. If it's a 2D plate, that's a lot less possible. So in the event that you have camera moves and different perspectives that you want to present, then the 3D renders are going to be more necessary.
Yeah, if parallax is important for the creative goal.
Right. So that's something that'll come up more throughout this conversation. So I wanted to be sure that we set that stage because some of the color considerations are different in those two different setups. So when it comes to lighting the talent, Ritchie, you mentioned that those larger screens, one of the added, I guess, benefits or complications, depending how you look at it, is that they affect the color of the actors and the practical sets that you have on stage. We actually have another panel coming up that's all specifically focused on lighting for the outer frustum, of, combining that screen with other lighting to get your talent lit in a way that makes them look like they belong in the environment that's being projected on the screens. So we're going to save most of that conversation for another one. But today, we're really focused on the color of what's actually getting captured in the camera. So to start that off, Rod, could you tell us a little bit about the flow of color processing? So when we're on one of these LED volumes, where is color being manipulated? How are we changing that? What are the things we can and can't affect, or maybe should and shouldn't be affecting as we're talking about that?
Yeah, there are a lot of places that color can be adjusted, and some of them are in software, some of them are in hardware, and you don't necessarily want to use all those controls, even though they're all available. So when we are in a color managed workflow, then that means we're trying to reduce the number of places that we do a lot of color changes. But the overall goal is to have something that looks right. And our definition of looks right is going to be based on something that we've already seen. So if, for example, someone has made 3D content in a game engine and they've been looking at it for a while there with a look applied to it, that content then gets displayed on the LED wall, gets shot by the camera, and then the footage from the camera gets linearized and gets that same LUT applied. Hopefully those two things match. And if that's true, then we have a slide here where we can show the fact that there's a lot of places where all those changes have to be dealt with. The virtual scene itself represents linear light, and there's rendering and a whole bunch of things going on inside of the renderer itself. And at the end, there's the display on the LED wall, and there's adjustments that can be made there. You want to handle whether or not you're in one color space or the other. And then when you finally photograph with the camera, there's also the fact that you may have white balanced because of other lighting on the set, get your exposure right, and encoding the footage. And then in order to bring that full circle, if we linearize that, that should look like a linear scene that we originally had. So that full circle is a color managed workflow. It's not always easy to do, but it is the goal that I think you want to strive for. That you can be sure that you started with something, and after all the work has happened, the end result also looks like what you started with.
So when it comes to that color process and getting that all figured out, who are the people that are involved in that? Like, who are the people that need to understand this flow and actually be involved in those conversations before? I know, Kris, you've been talking about that in our prep work for this.
Yeah, I think it's going to depend from production who those key stakeholders are. But depending on who that might be, it's largely going to involve the visual effects supervisor, the DP or cinematographer, potentially the gaffer, depending on what type of workflow this is. There are times where the virtual production team is integrating with on-set lighting, and their color needs to be communicated to those lights appropriately. As we're shooting plates, if the visual effects team is taking that on, we are working closely with them to define what that process looks like for the shooting of the plates, how that's going to be delivered in whatever codec that's responsible for being played by the playback server, or if those assets are ultimately going to land in the game engine. There's some key decisions that need to be made about how we want to preserve detail or color and how that may be used or influence the creative goal.
Now, I noticed, interestingly, in your list of people involved in that the director was not one of the names that you mentioned. And I'm curious if that was intentional or an oversight.
So I think that, in my experience, the directors are usually coming from a more creative place where they're assessing it on how the look and feel of something, and where that's more of a conversation about the creative process, and that where you're more coming at this from like a color grading standpoint where you're developing a look. And I think most of what we're doing in color management or virtual production is actually a technical solve, or we're solving a technical process that makes the creative choices or decisions that come after the fact about the look and the feel easier and more repeatable. And so they are certainly a part of this process, but I think when we're solving the technical challenge, it's more of the technical teams that are solving the sort of pipeline problem, which Ritchie has mentioned in previous talks. But they're not necessarily meant to be removed from this. They are just, in my opinion, more focused on a different part of this problem.
Well, that's a great segue to this next question, which is, what's the difference between how we manage color on the LED volume versus what the director and the colorist are going to do in post-production? Ritchie, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think Kris really alluded to it there, that on set we're really doing technical work. We're trying to achieve a technical performance of the color out of the LED display and into the camera in a way that recreates reality. It doesn't necessarily appear as the final graded image that really has more of that creative input in post. You're going in with a colorist and doing the grading work. On set, we're concerned with matching the lighting to the LED in the background. We're concerned with matching assets in the 3D engine with real physical assets on set. And so it's much more about matching and getting everything consistent and captured well, full dynamic range and full color gamut to then provide the most material to then feed into the post-color process.
Yeah, one thing to add to that is that at the end, the post-color process is going to happen on a big screen. And somebody's going to be dialing some knobs, and they're going to be looking at the movie the way it is intended to be viewed by final viewers. And it's possible for folks who have been in those rooms to also imagine that where you're on the LED stage, that, hey, that's a big screen too. But do not confuse them, because that big screen is intended to be the real world. It's supposed to be light. It's supposed to be the scene that you're shooting. And it's not supposed to look like a movie yet. We want that to happen last, and that happens much later in the post and color grading session.
Yeah, I think another way to get tripped up there is that a lot of the similar handles for color adjustment are available in both places. And so you may be tempted to apply manipulations, like Rod said earlier. There's lots of places in this whole pipeline where you can manipulate color. That doesn't mean you should necessarily manipulate color at that stage.
Right. And what's an example of what happens if you do, right? What if someone comes in there saying, oh, but I want this to have this, greenish cast to the whole film, so let's dial up, adjust the color here on the big LED screen that we're filming on. What happens then?
That's one of those places where you tend to paint yourself into a corner to some degree, because the colors that you alter now have altered the footage. And now you have to back out of those if that's a change that you don't like, whereas you could have got it anyway during the point at the end. It's better to treat the wall as the real world, try to keep it as simple and basic as possible. Then how it interacts with the foreground elements is really the key. We're trying to blend what's in front with what's behind, even though the virtual thing that is behind shouldn't feel like a separate item. It should all feel like one scene. And so you don't want to adjust it too much and have it then break that separation.
Right. So, Kris, maybe you could speak to this a little bit more, but let's say we did screw that up on set. What's involved in fixing that in post? What would be involved if we did make that mistake or did get a little too creative with our on-set lighting?
It sort of depends what somebody did specifically, but I think what I've seen in certain circumstances is where people, like Rod's alluding to, made it look cinematic in the virtual production environment. And what you end up with is something that looks cinematic in the background that doesn't necessarily paint the foreground actors or elements in the same way, and creates a separation between those things. And so when that gets to post, somebody needs to build the separate controls for the background and the foreground, right? So somebody's either rotoing those things or building a bunch of windows around in the color grading process for making those things match again. And that's tedious work, and work that could potentially have been avoided and saved a lot of time in post.
So Ritchie, earlier you mentioned we talked about having pre-filmed plates played back on the wall versus something that's being rendered in real time. We all touched on that briefly. When it comes to color, though, how does that change things? Like what are the advantages or disadvantages or some pitfalls of those pre-filmed versus real-time rendered scenes?
Yeah, the advantages, I guess, of if as Rod alluded to, you're not worried about parallax in the scene. So if it's a driving plate or something like that, they're very fast to capture versus creating assets from scratch. You do want to make sure that they're shot well as well and not pre-graded. They're presented as neutrally as possible in the volume. Similar to breaking things apart in post with a 3D scene, you can go in and manipulate the colors of individual objects at that point from a creative perspective. So if you want to change a shirt color or an object color in the background, that's something you can do more in real time, bringing the creative control into the moment, separate from overall color grading, but individual design choices. Both, I think it's important to think about the dynamic range of how you're capturing those. Again, really wanting to recreate reality. So making sure that you're using a high dynamic range and wide color gamut, either for plate capture or for asset creation using HDR and whatever, an ACES workflow or something like that. Don't limit to sRGB or Rec 709 capture or asset creation.
Got it. Yeah. And so with all of this, what are some ways that, so imagine, someone's watching this talk right now. They're a filmmaker who wants to use some virtual production in-camera VFX techniques for their next project. What are some of the ways that they can move these color processes earlier on in their pre-production process or in their planning process so that they can have a really good time on set and not a really stressful time either on set or in post trying to deal with these problems that they didn't even realize? Rod, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Okay. Yeah, one of the advantages to having a virtual scene is that you can tour it a lot of different ways. You can look at it from a bunch of different camera angles. You can scout the thing. And so you can spend a lot of time getting familiar with it, as well as the other heads of the department can also be equally familiar with it. And so there's a lot of capabilities early on for people to get the vision of what the show is going to be because they're actually looking at something. And further, that thing can be more or less correct the more that we have the right color pipeline in place. And so if the color LUT that is likely to be used on the eventual camera is available, then that can also be played on the 3D content, and you can get a sense of how the movie will look right there on your computer at home. And figure out your shots, figure out what your angles are, as well as learn some of the restrictions that you may have of, oh no, there's not room for me to bring in 100 people from the left because there's a wall there, so we might in fact have to make a hole and do some of these other tech viz plannings. So all that capability is there because the virtual scene is available. And then once you have that, you do these pre-vizzes or tech vizzes or stunt viz or whichever kind of viz you need to do long in advance of actually getting to shoot. And all that planning makes the shooting just that much more possible and clean.
Right. Yeah. Kris, do you want to talk at all about some of that process as it relates to color too?
Yeah, I think Rod touched on it briefly, but I think one thing that could benefit from moving into pre-production more often than we're seeing it today is colorists and that sort of creative conversation around the look, I think could happen sooner to help develop that look so that when, like Rod's saying, people are developing the assets or figuring out where to shoot, they're understanding it in the context that it will hopefully eventually look like. And I think if we do move that forward in the process, it means that when we're arriving on set, the DP, the cinematographer, they're already armed with having done a round with a colorist, right, to develop the look that they can now put that on their live grade. They can put that on their monitors. They can put that on their camera output so that they know that they're understanding what the set is going to look like or what the scene is going to look like in the final context of what's filming. And it also allows us to have a better conversation around the concept that we're grading after the footage, not necessarily before. And so I think the more conversation that we have about that gives us more opportunities to keep this sort of on the tracks or keep that production on the tracks. And so I only see a benefit of moving at least some of that process forward to at least establish what the look might look like.
I think from a technical perspective as well, moving the validation of the interaction between the LED and the camera as much toward the camera package prep as possible really pays dividends on set. You don't need a full wall during camera prep to validate the color performance. You just need a portion of it. So if you can get a representative sample of the product that you've got or you will be using and bring it in to your camera setup bay, if you've got some standard evaluation material that you can play on it, again, known colors or content from that's already been developed for the production, that's great. And just get those things validated as early as possible.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it seems like something I've noticed as a theme across all sorts of parts of the process of virtual production is just how much more we need to be having conversations with the people who are going to be working in post, with the people who are doing the pre-planning, and also that they're sharing those assets through that whole process. So that if we dialed this color in and got that HDR material that we need, that we actually have that through the whole process, even if we needed to make an adjustment in post or something like that. So that's just...
It had to be repeatable and predictable.
Right. Yeah, it needs to be consistent. Yeah.
Exactly.
So to go to talking about these real-time rendered scenes, right? So we're using a game engine, we're moving around, we're getting parallax, we're able to make all these little tiny changes to different objects in the scene. Rod, can you tell us a little bit about when this is actually happening in productions? Is it most often that people are just making one overall change through a post-process volume in Unreal, for example, or changing the actual virtual lights in the scene to try to match what's in real life, or changing the color temperature of those? Or is it more often just changing the assets themselves? What are some things people should be aware of with that?
Yeah, all the capabilities are there. There's a lot of knobs that are available to you, and so you don't want to just turn them all. One of the things that is really important about this is that it's likely that for one particular shot, you may want an adjustment that you don't need for the next shot. And so keeping track of the fact that those changes have been made is an important aspect of just getting production done in general. And so having simple places where you can do those, your go-to spots, then when in Unreal, for example, you can do level snapshots, you can keep track of which shot was done which way. And so an overall adjustment of, well, let's just bring it down a quarter stop because we need things to be dark, that's an easy control to have. But there may be local controls that are necessary just because of the angle of things that you're looking at. For example, one of the things that is true in these volumes is that there's a point at which the LEDs stop and the floor is where they meet, and that may be in camera, that seam. And so doing a little bit of adjustment to the bottom set of LEDs, just with a color correct region is the mechanism that we use. It's a general control over kind of a region-based thing, but there are also things where you can just do per object, where you say, you know what, that chair is just too bright and I'm not sure why, but let's just bring it down. So there are good reasons to do each of those, and it's very much how you would do it on a normal stage anyway. So, but keeping track of the fact that you did it, I think, is the additional benefit that we have with the virtual production tools.
Yeah, it's bringing to mind all of those little tweaks that happen on practical sets as well, right? It's like, oh, we're going to tilt that mirror a little bit for this shot so it's not capturing this lighting fixture. Or, oh, you know what, we're actually going to strike the chair from this even though it should be there, but it's distracting where it is. Those kinds of things that I bet a lot of script supervisors wish they could have a level snapshot for real life too, where they could just save all those positions.
Would be handy, yes.
Yeah. So I want to bring us back to talking a little bit about the LED panels themselves and how those influence our color and our color options and choices and things like that. So if we're building a stage from scratch, we obviously get to choose, which LED panels, which LED processors, which render nodes, all of that stuff, we get to pick that. But I would say most of the time when people are working in virtual production, you just show up on the set, you got hired as the colorist, here you are, this is what we're working with. Are there some kind of, I know this is a deep topic that could probably be its own 8-hour talk or something like that, but what are some things that are worth being aware of in terms of maybe what can or can't be accomplished with certain panels, if there's certain specs of those panels that we need to be aware of, and in terms of making our color choices or certain types of shots that might only be possible on certain stages, anything like that to help give some guidance to our viewers?
Well, I think to start with, the overall just knowledge of how the panels work, that they only can go so bright. You might want to know how bright that is. There are different ones that can go brighter, and so you might use those in a different context. And one common context is the wall versus the ceiling. The ceiling is more like a light source that you don't point the camera at very much. So often the type of panels that people use in their ceiling can go a little bit brighter because it's trying to represent the sky or something else. It can get more complicated than that, and your other panel that's going to talk about how lighting fixtures map into this. But it does matter because when in the end, we're really just driving this with an image. We have a red, green, blue value that is coming through. We're showing it on the LEDs or we're showing it on a fixture. And then that stuff is bouncing around the scene and then being captured by camera. So we want to make sure that we have all those capabilities done properly. But part of the control for that is in the LED processor, that we don't have to necessarily know that these LEDs are slightly different than those LEDs because the LED processor calibration factors that out and makes them even again. So there's a lot of places where this can be controlled, but there are groups who do most of that work, and those are the folks that you want to trust with that.
I think another important point here is not every panel, because they don't have the same brightnesses, they may also not have the same amount of values that are indistinguishable values that they can display. And so that might be an important characteristic to understand when you're looking at a LED panel that may be made fairly cheaply. They may not have the same, what we would call bit depth, but they may not be able to display the same amount of values. And if that's an important detail for what you're trying to shoot or capture, that could be a really important distinguishing feature between those things. And then there's also a number of artifacts that may come into play that I think is important to put in front of camera, especially if it's a untested tile or one that doesn't have as much experience within your crew. There may be some banding or artifacts that you may not be able to get rid of depending on that product. And so I think it's important to sort of understand those things, because that could be a really costly problem for you as you move into production and eventually into post, where you intended for this to be something to save you from going into post, and it ultimately became something that ensured you had to.
Yeah, for sure. There's also, as Rod alluded to, we can put a lot of these LED displays into standard color spaces, but the LED technologies are typically wider on the red and green and slightly smaller on the blue than even a Rec 2020 or a P3 color space. So if your LED processor allows it and your rendering engine allows it, sometimes it's better to set the LED processor to just pass through the color values and tell the renderer what the capabilities of the display are, so it can render exactly for that. Again, that would be more of an advanced technique or a complicated setup perhaps, but it may give you a better reproduction if you've got lots of saturated colors in your scene. Maybe if it's more of a fantasy world, or there's neons or sunsets or something like that. And as Kris alluded to earlier, the bit depth is somewhat related to color, but it's really how smoothly can a display recreate a gradient. And so if you've got a smooth something like this ceiling, which is going from sort of a gray to another gray in the background, we want that to appear as smooth as possible and not have banding or steps within that gradient. And sunsets, again, are particularly prone to that, or big sky shots as well.
Yeah, one way to help with that is if you have content that you know and are familiar with, the more that's available to you, and you can just put it up on the wall and say, oh yeah, this is set up right because I recognize this. That's super helpful. And so there are activities going on out in SMPTE, for example, where they're trying, and the ASC, trying to get some of these standard materials so that people can do that in general and they don't have to bring their own. But having your own is super helpful. If there's a thing that you just know you can bring it with you, and you pull that out, put it up, and you said, okay, well, now let's do the real show. That gives you a good bootstrap to make sure that you're in the right place.
Yeah, that's great. And so on a related note to that, what about color spaces? I know this is also could be its own 8-hour talk, talking about color spaces. Even as someone who worked in VFX for 10 years before this, I'm still overwhelmed by color spaces and color science because there's just so much to it. But what are some things that filmmakers should be aware of when approaching an LED volume in terms of color spaces, both for stuff that they filmed in advance or even for how they're doing that color space translation to put it up onto the wall?
I think it's important for us to be continuing the pursuit for wider color spaces and wider color gamuts. So things like ACES CG or even the camera's encoding spaces themselves, they generally are fairly wide and a lot wider than what we're used to looking at on our monitors at home or even some of our monitors at work. And I think it's important to try and preserve as much of that information as possible, because in a world where we're trying to simulate reality, we want to make as much of that data available as possible, as Ritchie alluded to earlier. And so I think it's important for us to continue that pursuit. And I do think that what is happening in the ACES community is the right pursuit in the right direction. I think we should be heading more towards that and making that more a part of the standard sort of workflow, even in virtual production.
I think one difference here with virtual production is that traditionally on the acquisition side of things, the color spaces and encodings have been scene referred or linear and really enabled to hold a lot more information than displays typically, which were a display referred color space and gamma encoding. And those were targeting traditionally a standard definition display that might have a peak luminance of about 200 nits, maybe a fairly small color gamut of sRGB or something like that. But in this use case, we're really trying, again, to simulate reality as much as possible with the LED display. And while it isn't capable of 100% simulating reality, it's a lot closer to that than a lot of other display technologies. And so leveraging the containers and encoding formats that have been used on the acquisition side and the scene referred and inside the game engines, where there's just linear light and it can go extremely bright as far as the scene is concerned. And then as the display technologies mature and evolve, they will continue to get better at being able to reproduce that information.
Yeah, the one thing I would add with that is that there are a lot of color spaces available and they all have different names and there's different specifications associated with them. The main thing that you want to do is make sure that you match the two ends. The thing that you're sending is in a color space and you know you're doing it, and the thing that is receiving it wants to know that that's what it's receiving. As long as those two match, that mostly solves this problem. As Kris said, it's preferable if those are wider color spaces because then you can represent more of what goes on in the real world, and that is preferred, and the LEDs are also wider. But there's a lot of color science out there that is hard to understand, and I'll give you that it is hard to understand because a lot of it was written for the display device of paper. And this isn't what we're doing. We're not doing ink, and we're not doing some of these things where everything has to roll off the highlights. We're trying to represent things that are HDR. And so in a way, some of that color science is quite easy, but there's a lot of distraction color science that will be hard to follow if you're just looking for it all by yourself on the internet.
Now, when you talk about the color space going out and then the color space that's receiving it, is that referring to the color space you're putting on your screen and then the camera that's capturing it? Or do you mean the LED processor on the volume that's receiving that signal?
Actually, more for signals, but it's a good point. It keeps showing up. So one of them is there's a signal that is going to leave the game engine, and you want to make sure that the thing that is receiving that signal understands what it is. And LED processors have a setting for guessing at what it is, and you want to make sure that those two match up. Likewise, there's a point at which the camera shows up. Now, the camera is evaluating light, and it doesn't know the difference between that's an LED wall and that's a real object. And so it doesn't have to match color spaces because from its point of view, everything is light. So we don't really have to match anything in particular there. We want to just best cover whatever the real world would have looked like with our LED wall, and then let the camera do what it does with light. And then after that, the rest of the post-process of doing, whether you're going from camera log to some viewing like 709 view, that's the rest of the pipeline down the stream.
I know that he didn't mean to skip over it, but I think there's a part here where we're profiling the camera and doing something to the rendering side to make up for the inconsistencies of how the cameras perceive the display technologies. And that's an important step. And I know we would all agree with that fact.
Yeah, that showed up in the earlier slide of a calibration matrix that was in that sequence of steps that we were showing there. And we didn't highlight exactly where it comes from, but it's nice if it's there because it helps get things just much more correct from end to end.
I think that's a good summary of a color managed workflow where there's maybe different containers that are appropriate for an asset or a signal at any point from plate acquisition all the way through to final color, but there's transformations at the intersection points where an asset leaves one system and goes into the other. And as Rod says, the color management of a managed workflow is that you're making an intentional transformation between those two color spaces. It's not just flowing through and being interpreted in some possibly unknown way. And that's really critical to understand that at every point that a pixel or object is going to transition through this whole pipeline.
Yeah, for those who want to see this doing it wrong, all you got to do is take the monitor that's on your desk and push one of those buttons that sets it to Adobe RGB or Rec 2020 or P3 or something that's not the right thing, and that's doing the wrong thing as far as the content that was sending and the content that was receiving. If those don't match up, then of course the end-to-end doesn't look correct. And this is a fairly common problem and easy to get wrong, but if you do get it right, then you should have a good management from end to end.
Awesome. So we're nearly at the end of our webinar, and I want to get some final thoughts from each of you. So let's just say what's an important lesson that you've learned from working on LED volumes? And let's start with Rod, actually.
One of the things that I think is important is, again, you're trying to make the LED wall feel like the real world. And so to demonstrate that to yourself, if there's some knob that is exposure for the wall, you can bring it up and down a stop, and it truly goes up and down a stop, then you're in good shape in order to do any of the other controls that you might wish you could do. And if it's not set up right, that won't feel right. Some of the content will get dark, but the rest of it may stay bright or whatever, even though that doesn't feel like it should have happened. And so just double checking that let's bring it down a stop. Let's bring it up a stop. Does it feel like it did that? If you can get that demonstration, then the other controls that are available to you, and there are a lot, should also feel like they work correctly. And that's a good way to confirm that you're at least on the right track and you can do the work that you need to do.
Kris, how about you?
I think an important takeaway for me would be that collaboration is key. We shouldn't be afraid of having conversation with our collaborators in production. It's important for us to understand who's going to do what and how it should happen. And as we build more and more of these hybrid systems where we're crossing the boundaries between these various departments and, pixel mapping fixtures with our lighting folk, or lighting folk are controlling our systems for in-camera visual effects, for doing lighting effects and stuff like that, it's important for us to understand who's going to do what and how do we communicate to each other on a personal level from just collaborators working together, but also even our signal types and how we're going to control each other's products. And those are important distinctions to make, especially even as we, leave and go into post. It's important for everybody to kind of understand what the deliverables are and who's going to do what again.
And Ritchie, how about you?
Yeah, and as Kris and Rod alluded to, there may be a camera-to-wall calibration step where we line up the sensor sensitivities of the camera to the particular primary response of the wall, and doing that step may result in an LED display that doesn't look correct by eye. It doesn't look created creatively, and it doesn't necessarily look like reality. And one thing to really keep in mind on set is that the output is from the camera. It's not from the eye of someone that's on set. So really trust your on-set monitoring and use that to evaluate whether you've got it right out of the camera. If it looks wrong to the eye, that may be correct. And if you correct it to look right on eye, that may now be incorrect on camera. That's really important to keep in mind.
Right. Brings us back full circle to this idea that we need to have that full circle of getting it onto the wall through the camera and then look at what we got on the camera to make sure it looks like we want it to. Fantastic. And that is all the time that we have for today. First, I want to thank our panelists for sharing your experiences. So Ritchie, Rod, and Kris, thank you all so much for being here and sharing this with all of our viewers.
Absolutely. It's been an honor.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having us.
I would also like to thank all of you who listened to this panel. You are the future of virtual production, and we can't wait to see what you create. Thank you all.